Okay, tēnā tātou katoa, kia ora, welcome. E hoa mā, e hoa mahima, kua tai mai ki te kōrero o te ata nei. Welcome to you all who have come to this 2021 John David Stout Lecture. Welcome to those of you who are here in the room, those of you who are watching live stream due to the circumstances in which we find ourselves, and those of you who will view it later as we are recording the lecture as well. One condition of holding the John David Stout Fellowship is that the fellow must give a lecture late in the year outlining their project. The fellowship itself is perhaps unique in New Zealand universities, being focused on scholarly non-fiction work in New Zealand culture, however broadly defined, rather perhaps than in the creative writing field, for which a number of other fellows existed. It's named for and is funded by the trust established by Dr. John David Stout, who was born in 1925 and died in 1982. Dr. Stout was a member of that family so much associated with this university, with the law, with medicine, with science, and with intellectual pursuits generally. He himself was by profession a soil scientist and a biologist. But more than that, his scientific interests included New Zealand grasslands, both native and exotic, and the beach forests of these islands. He was a true polymath with interests and indeed qualifications in philosophy, and also ranged widely across the humanities and heritage generally. And the trust he created toward the end of his life to promote and preserve New Zealand's cultural and environmental heritage. And the Stout Centre for New Zealand Studies and this fellowship are, of course, among the beneficiaries of Dr. Stout's generosity, and indeed the generosity of other members of his family as well. Well, this year's fellow, Nick Bollinger, whose company we have very much enjoyed, is a distinguished musician, writer, critic, and broadcaster. He's been a columnist for The Listener. He presents and produces The Sampler, a music program on national radio most weeks, and as well he's the author of 3 books of non-fiction: How to Listen to Pop Music, 100 Essential New Zealand Albums, and most recently his highly praised 2016 memoir, Goneville. So without further ado, would you please welcome Nick Bollinger to give the 2021 John David Stout Lecture.
Tēnā koutou katoa. In 2015, I took a break from my regular gig as a broadcaster and music critic to spend a year writing a book, which I did as a master's student at the International Institute of Modern Letters, just 2 doors up from the Stout Research Centre. My plan was to write the history of a brief yet pivotal period in the development of New Zealand music. That turned into a book called Goneville, which was partly the one I'd set out to write, and partly something else, something more personal than I'd first intended, a combination history and memoir of my experiences as a musician in the late 1970s. While I was researching Goneville, meeting people, recording interviews, trawling through archives, I kept stumbling on stories that fell outside the project I was working on, but suggested another book yet to be written, a book about the background against which a lot of the events in Goneville took place, about this country and some of the cultural divisions that defined it during that time. And ever since Goneville was published in 2016, I've been working on that book. And this year, as the JD Stout Fellow, I've had the real privilege of being able to research and write full-time, and I expect to complete the book by the time I finish at the Stout Centre next February, and it should be published later next year. It's become the story of what's often referred to as the counterculture. Counterculture is a term social theorists began using in the 1950s, but it was Theodore Roszak who really introduced it into the vernacular in the late 60s when he identified the emergence of what he called a culture so radically disaffiliated from the mainstream assumptions of our society that it scarcely looks to many as a culture at all, but takes on the alarming appearance of a barbaric intrusion. Rozak was an American and had spent part of the 60s in London. His 1969 book, The Making of a Counterculture, helped what was in many ways a group of disparate elements to see itself as an entity. The counterculture, as Rozak defined it, encompassed many different activities: political protest, communitarian experiments, drug-taking, mysticism, and rock music, among other things. The book was popular, especially among those who thought they might be part of this barbaric intrusion or liked the sound of it and wanted to know how they could join in. By the late 60s, the term counterculture was in common use and remained so for much of the following decade. The counterculture was primarily driven by members of the generation known as the baby boomers, those born between the end of the Second World War and the early 1960s. At the start of the 60s, the first members of this generation were nearing adulthood. And as the decade unfolded and rolled into the next, they would challenge and change many of the things their parents had accepted as social norms. The counterculture, when examined, can seem wildly diverse, but two particular issues help unify it: nuclear weapons and the Vietnam War. Though both remained active issues throughout the period, the atomic bomb dominated the early part, Vietnam the latter. There was a broad agreement that both represented the moral bankruptcy of the dominant culture. A world that could devise such an effective means of destroying itself or send its youth to an unjust war, such as the one that was being waged in Vietnam, clearly had something wrong with it and demanded a radical response. Not that all, or even the majority of the counterculture involved themselves in politics in the traditional sense. Many explicitly rejected the political system as another indicator that mainstream society had it wrong. Yet the very existence of a counterculture could be seen as political. To grow one's hair, to live with someone without being married, to take psychedelic drugs or explore Eastern spirituality or start an intentional community, all became in their ways political acts. It's by examining the sometimes surprising ways that such different types of actions and ideas were bound together that one can begin to see a movement, albeit one made up of many parts. There are other words that are used almost synonymously with counterculture. When people refer to the hippie era, or even or flower power, or even that impossibly broad term, the 60s, it's usually as a kind of shorthand for the things that Rozak called the counterculture. So I'll stick with the term counterculture because I think it's broad enough to encompass it all. The counterculture was in many ways utopian in its aspirations. If it rejected the world as it was, it had a fervent belief that things could be changed for the better. To some, this meant dropping out and starting again. To some, it meant recalibrating one's mind. A term that entered the discourse around this time was a change of consciousness. In other words, seeing and thinking about existence in an entirely different way. And this was attempted by a variety of means, some of which I'll go into in a moment. The counterculture was global, though its origins are sometimes traced to the San Francisco Bay Area of California, where such visible expressions of counterculturalism as the People's Parks, Human Be-Ins, and the Haight-Ashbury hippie community were centred. Versions of this movement sprang up all over the world, from young dissidents in Prague who'd gather in secret to hear the outlawed music of the local rock band Plastic People of the Universe, to the French students who combined with workers to bring the economy to a standstill in 1968, demanding, among other things, the rights of students to sleep together, a classic countercultural claim, as we'll see. A catch cry common to all of them was freedom, a word that, as was demonstrated only yesterday in the streets of Wellington, can stand for many different things. By the late 60s, you could see countercultural movements all over the world, linked to each other's struggles by a shared repertoire of imagery, slogans, fashion statements, and music. This country had its own version of that repertoire with its own distinctive characteristics, and that's the one that I've set out to discover. So, what was there to struggle against here in New Zealand? On the surface, New Zealand in 1960 did not seem like a place ripe for revolution, though despite the country's homogenous myth, there were both cultural and economic divisions, particularly between Pākehā and Māori. Nevertheless, most New Zealanders had a roof over their heads, and the number of families owning their own homes was rising. The number of people registered as unemployed was 403. The major cities were growing and farms flourishing. Families could mostly get by on a single wage, provided that while the husband went to work, the wife stayed at home unpaid to look after the children, house, and have dinner ready when the man returned at the end of the day. In 1960, university intakes were also booming. In a couple of years, a bursary system covering student fees and boarding costs would be introduced. Over the course of the decade, bursaries would increase and the number attending university more than triple. But there was also what Sandra Coney, looking back in the 1980s, identified as a strong strand of Philistinism and anti-intellectualism, with academics and artists stereotyped as bearded, sandaled beatniks, failures when it came to the real business of being a New Zealand man. And what made a real New Zealand man? Well, playing rugby for one thing. Rugby was perhaps only slightly more than it is now a national obsession, with the myth that the All Blacks were the embodiment of the country's social unity, despite the fact that only men participated in the game, and that when our national team went to play against their greatest rivals, the Springboks in South Africa, Maori were not allowed onto the field. There was also a national preoccupation with drinking beer, although the public bars where most of this occurred were female-free zones, and due to an anachronism left over from the First World War, all pubs closed at 6 p.m. So the hour between 5 when men knocked off work and closing time an hour later had become known as the 6 o'clock swill, during which time men tried to consume as much alcohol as possible before staggering home to their families. Such cultural quirks were often remarked upon by visitors from overseas. The Cold War was underway, and New Zealand, increasingly bound to America and its anti-communist ideology, was playing its part. Any New Zealand citizens suspected of having communist sympathies were likely to be subjected to state scrutiny, which was carried out by the recently formed Security Intelligence Service. Also attracting a degree of state scrutiny were teenagers, particularly those growing up in the new housing settlements, like the suburbs of Upper and Lower Hutt, where reports of sexual immorality among juveniles had spurred a government inquiry in the mid-1950s that became known as the Masingard Report. This report, among other things, recommended that radio serials should emphasise the message crime doesn't pay, and that contraceptives should be kept out of the hands of adolescents at all costs. At almost exactly the same moment, rock and roll arrived on the scene, highlighting the division between what teenagers wanted and the things that were deemed suitable for them by broadcasting authorities and their parents. So, by 1960, New Zealand offered a few things for a young person to rebel against, even if the main one might have been simply that the place was a bit dull. The revolution didn't arrive overnight, but more as a series of incursions. I briefly mentioned the atomic bomb and the psychological effect that its existence had on the post-war generation. One of the first rallying points for the incipient counterculture was CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Again, this was a global movement. It had begun in Britain in the late 1950s. In New Zealand, it was led by a combination of old communists and left-wingers, and some of the more socially progressive church people, such as the Reverend Alan Brash, father of Don Brash. But CND's lack of formal ideology and party political affiliations were an attraction to a growing group of young nonconformists, enabling them to focus anti-establishment feelings on a single issue, which could be boiled down to a choice between good and evil. For them, the appeal of politics was essentially existential. Although C&D strove to be seen by the wider community as respectable and representative of a larger group than just the young and disaffected, it was in these terms that the establishment tended to portray it. Covering a 1961 march in Wellington to mark the 16th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, the Evening Post noted, quote, "The usual representation of university students, plus a number of leather-jacketed young men in suede shoes, corduroy trousers, and a few who sported beards." In 1963, a group of young Aucklanders formed Youth C&D, and other branches quickly sprung up around the country. In Auckland, they staged a hunger strike on the steps of a church. Over the summer of 1964, Youth C&D members from various centres gathered at Tahunanui Beach in Nelson, where they endeavoured to spread the anti-nuclear message to holidaymakers through folk singing, films and puppet shows. There they are. There's at least one future Member of Parliament in that photo. The most visible of C&D's activities was always the Easter March, which took place every Easter and was set out on Good Friday from somewhere north of Wellington and arrive on Easter Sunday at Parliament buildings. Though there was a concern among the elders of the movement that the marches should present a dignified face to the public, some of the younger marchers brought guitars and sang, and there was a generally lively spirit to the events. Yet by 1964, the turnout was already dropping off. Writing in Salient at the time, Murray Rowlands, one of the younger C&D supporters, blamed a sharp drop in numbers on the overriding demand there seems to be on a nice public image. He said that arguments about whether or not marchers should be allowed to sing and resistance to what he called direct and positive action, such as sit-downs, had alienated younger members. And though nuclear weapons would continue to be one focus of youth protest, generational divisions continued to widen both inside and outside the anti-nuclear movement as young New Zealanders pursued an increasingly personal politics. Now, the bomb wasn't the only thing that got young New Zealanders out on the streets that year. The Beatles flew into Wellington on a Sunday, the day on which the country was usually closed, to find 7,000 young people lining the airport fences. The devotees then followed the group's motorcade from Rongotai into the city, where they jammed the streets around the St George Hotel. During the Beatles' stay, the hotel saw break-ins, bomb threats, and a suicide attempt. Similar scenes would be repeated over the days that followed as the Beatles travelled to play concerts in Auckland, Dunedin and Christchurch. In Auckland, Mayor Dovemeyer Robinson turned on a civic welcome, despite grumblings from councillors such as Tom Pearce. Pearce was president of the Auckland Rugby Football Union, had managed the All Blacks' 1960 tour of South Africa, from which Maori players were banned, and declared that, quote, "If we are going to pander to the hysteria, antics, adulation, rioting, screaming and roaring, then I think we should make a point of honouring any youths with a sporting background who are at least endeavouring to act in the best traditions of the young men of the nation." Pearce, as it happens, was Sandra Coney's father. Thousands of school-age fans defied threats of expulsion and wagged classes to attend the welcome, while New Zealand tried to understand the effect the Beatles were having on its children. Tony Taylor, professor of psychology here at Victoria University at the time, undertook a unique project. With special dispensation from the police to access restricted areas, he and 10 senior psychology students set about recruiting teenage subjects from the crowds around the airport, hotel, concerts and local schools. He then administered a series of psychological tests in what he called a search for relationships between their personality factors and social background and their enthusiasm for the Beatles. In a report that would appear in the British Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology, he concluded, There was no evidence from the hysteria scale of the Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory to support the popular opinion that the enthusiasts were hysterics. Beatlemania, he wrote, is the passing reaction of predominantly young adolescent females to group pressures of such a kind that meets their special emotional needs. But perhaps even better place to explain the enthusiasm and special emotional needs would be a young adolescent female. Writing to the Dominion as Beatle fan 6,309,612 of Wadestown, one young adolescent female posited this. She wrote, "Maybe the deep down reason is frustrations and tensions, but my reason is simply because screaming is enjoyable. The Beatles have all the vital ingredients necessary for good screaming, lots of noise, a loud beat, other screamers, and encouragement so you can let yourself go and scream as much as you like. Anyway, where else can you scream? Have a wild time." The 15-year-old writer of that letter, as I discovered during my research, was one Rachel Stace, who told me that she'd had a number of adventures during the Beatles' visit, including talking her way past the doorman at the town hall to see the group's second concert, even though she didn't have a ticket, and being escorted by police from a fire escape outside the St. George Hotel after an unsuccessful attempt to pay the group a private visit. The Beatles' audience may have been dominated by young women, but they also offered a kind of liberation to the New Zealand male by defying the popular image of masculinity. They were skinny and long-haired at a time when long hair, a term originally coined for dead classical composers, still meant effete intellectuals. Basically, they were the opposite of rugby players. The Beatles were themselves ultimately shaped by the counterculture, at least as much as it was shaped by them. Over the next few years, they would be early adopters of most significant countercultural trends, which they would transmit to all corners of the world, New Zealand included, via the massive telegraph system of their music. Yet, even when Beatlemania was still in its infancy, the cultural reverberations were inescapable. It was hard to deny their radiant harmonies and their working-class wit. The New Zealand Broadcasting Corporation had no choice but to play their records, and happily complied. In the end, everybody was a little bit of a Beatles fan, which could not necessarily be said for other British bands that toured in the Beatles' wake. The Rolling Stones and the Pretty Things, both of whom visited in 1965, didn't bother with the harmonic sweetenings, witty repartee or tidy uniforms. They were hairy and scary, looked like layabouts, and drew heavily on the black American blues, lending a London leer to the music's inherent sex and swagger. The Stones had begun to augment their blues covers with originals that expressed even more directly their cynical view of modern society, summed up in songs like "I Can't Get No Satisfaction." On stage, they defied social norms in other ways. Phil Gifford recalled to me their first concert in Auckland in 1965. He said, "When the curtains parted, there were 4 Stones playing twice as loud as I'd ever heard a band play before, and the fans started screaming. Then they went totally crazy when Mick Jagger appeared, rattling maracas and did his heel toe and back again sideways dance across the stage. When he got to Keith Richards, he leaned in and kissed him on the cheek. And for a couple of stunned, weird seconds, the girls stopped in astonished mid-scream. It was 1965, and in New Zealand, we didn't do androgyny. It took a song or two before the fans were back to full volume again." Though not nearly as famous as the Beatles or Stones, and nowhere near their league as songwriters, the Pretty Things nevertheless rivaled both groups in terms of how much publicity they were able to generate during their short stay, thanks mostly to the extra musical activities of their drummer, Viv Prince. A little older than the rest of the group, he was a drunk, a surrealist, and an outrageous clown. Between shows, he would rampage about sleepy New Zealand streets, dressed in a bedspread, a leopard skin pillbox hat, and brandishing a light bulb. It was taken in Christchurch in the early hours one morning by the drummer, the New Zealand drummer in the band that supported them on their tour. He'd disrupt the other acts on the touring bill. He drank alcohol out of a boot. He lit fires in provincial theatres. To newspaper reporters hoping to scandalise their readers, he was a willing co-conspirator. For the fortnight that they were in the country, the pretty things were just constantly in the headlines. When the time finally came for the things to depart, Pan American officials evicted Prince from the plane for being intoxicated, forcing him to spend a further night in New Zealand. The last images of him in this country show him in an airport lounge, beating a tambourine and waving a large crayfish. But the Pretty Things Auckland Town Hall concert also happened to provide a recruitment opportunity for a new organisation that was just starting to make itself known, the Progressive Youth Movement, or PYM. The Auckland PYM had begun in August 1965 at a meeting of 24 or so people, all in their teens and early 20s. Roughly half were students, the remainder blue-collar workers and apprentices. The Pretty Things' arrival that same month saw the newly formed organisation parading outside the venue with posters and successfully recruiting some of the young fans to their ranks. As the fledgling political group grew, tertiary students tended to drop out, and the proportion of young workers, apprentices and secondary school students increased. Initially, they called themselves Youth Action Committee on Vietnam. As their interests widened over the next few months, the name became Auckland Progressive Youth, with movement added some time later. Talking to Paul Jackman in 1979 for his thesis on the anti-Vietnam War movement in Auckland, founding member Anna Lee said, "It was clear that once you start questioning one issue, such as New Zealand being involved in the war, you start running into all kinds of interconnected things," and cited big business, American financial interests, and the relationship between the police and the status quo as other areas of concern. As Jackman would observe, what the PYM emphasised was the radicalisation and mobilisation of young people as an end in itself. The PYM had gleaned from the worldwide media coverage of the black civil rights movement in America that protest acts generated the greatest publicity when they were met with violence. So when the South Vietnamese leader, Air Vice Marshal Key, arrived at Mangere Airport in 1966, one of a series of visitors who came to encourage New Zealand's contribution to the Vietnam War, it was a PYM member, John Gabelinski, who committed the first major act of protest by throwing himself in front of Key's car. He was quickly apprehended by police, but the event was captured by television news cameras. Talking to Jackman about the incident 12 years later, Gabelinski recalled that when he'd arrived at work the next day, he was surrounded by his workmates who'd seen him being manhandled on television and now agreed that all the things he'd been telling them about the relationship between the police and the status quo must be right. Gabelinski's interpretation of the value of such an act was a typical example of PYM thinking. Such headline-grabbing stunts would change the public face of protest, along with strategies borrowed from the international protest movements such as sit-downs or sit-ins, teach-ins, and the development of an underground media. All of this both reflected and fed into a burgeoning counterculture that was essentially youth-driven. It was clear that the PYM was cut from a different cloth from the middle-class, student-led youth C&D. Although different PYMs sprung up in different parts of the country with little coordination between them. The Wellington PYM, for instance, had a much more of a student base and presence on campus. In Christchurch, the PYM was a student worker alliance. But while it would be fair to say that the counterculture as a whole was predominantly middle class, the PYM was one corner where connections were made between social groups that had not traditionally mixed. While the PYM were rebellious, confrontational and countercultural, the Auckland branch, according to several close observers I spoke to, enjoyed the time-honoured Kiwi tradition of barbecues and beer. But in other parts of the counterculture, other forms of recreation were becoming the norm. In its utopianism, the counterculture would imagine many kinds of enlightenment: sexual, societal, spiritual, psychological. And for some, the source of those imaginings and the gateway to them was drugs. The use of marijuana amplified the sense of otherness that already existed among the countercultural crowd. not least because it was illegal, added to their questioning of such beliefs as the necessity of war or the sanctity of the nuclear family, and removed them even further from the rugby beer and home improvement society from which they'd already felt estranged. Its effects were so markedly different from those of alcohol that drinkers became an object of their derision. The marijuana users developed their own vocabulary. Fellow users were potheads, or simply heads. They turned on, got high, far out, strange, bizarre, they would mutter as they contemplated some aspect of the straight world with their freshly rearranged synapses, or registered some small, curious coincidence, the significance of which appeared magnified in their altered state. But an even more profound influence was LSD. In New Zealand's medical world, some psychiatrists have been using this hallucinogenic drug, sometimes called a psychedelic drug, in treatment programs since the early 60s. In the October 1966 edition of the New Zealand Medical Journal, Dr. David Livingston of Calvary Private Hospital in Christchurch wrote positively of LSD as a therapeutic tool, though he cautioned about the dangers should the drug with its, quote, life-threatening personality disintegrating propensities fall into the hands of unskilled experimenters. This, he suggested, would seem to be akin to the release of atomic fission products in an agricultural irrigation scheme or the handing over of a pressure cooker to a 9-year-old child. But it was too late. New Zealanders were already conducting their own unskilled experiments. Rachel, who you'll remember as Beatle fan 6,309,612 of Wadestown, was just one of many who by the late 60s had followed her idols down the psychedelic path. Interviewing her just a couple of years ago, she described to me how she and her friends would, quote, put on our tripping clothes and go off to the park and sit in the trees. Goodness knows what people thought, but it was very innocent, just sitting there, giggling, looking at nature. In fact, it was the foundation of my spiritual beliefs, because you realised you were all interconnected and there was some sort of living force that you couldn't really see properly until you were on acid, LSD. And then it all became clear. Nature was beautiful, the world was beautiful, and it was all amazing. Not so amazingly, by 1967, government authorities had begun a campaign against the drug, taking its cue from British and American responses and bolstered by lurid newspaper stories from overseas. An LSD devotee might well jump from a window and kill himself on the I can fly assumption, reported the Dominion, quoting a consultant to the US Presidential Crime Commission under the headline, Deranging Drug. New mystery drug sending hippies to their deaths, rang the headline in the Evening Post, reporting that in San Francisco, LSD might soon be superseded by a new drug, STP, which flies them farther out and keeps them higher longer than LSD. Other reports suggested that LSD was addictive. In mid-1967, Minister of Police Percy Allen had returned from a trip to the United States, where he met narcotics and law enforcement chiefs in California and Chicago, convinced that the laws covering the use of LSD in New Zealand needed to be tightened. He had, he said, seen teenage LSD addicts firsthand in San Francisco. I saw them by the hundreds in the park, he said. Some wore shirts with the slogan, "Give LSD a try, it's the only way to fly." The addicts were dirty and unkempt. I was disgusted. To Allen, like his US counterparts, controlling the use of LSD was evidently more than just a health issue or a question of public safety. The drug represented a set of values and choices that differed dramatically from those of his generation. But though the likes of Percy Allen blamed drugs for what they perceived to be a creeping degeneracy, many young New Zealanders had already begun to live their lives in ways that diverged radically from those of their parents before drugs entered the picture. One of those young New Zealanders, Ken James, told me, until the early 1970s, drugs were very hard to come by. Most of us formed our views before their arrival. I believe that drugs had more influence on those who didn't take them. who realised that their thinking and their way of life was under threat, which it was. End of quote. One visible flowering of this lifestyle was the rock festival, or happening, which brought together various manifestations of the counterculture, including drugs and sex, but also things like yoga workshops, Krishna meditation and vegetarian food, all around the unifying element of rock music. The rock festival wasn't something New Zealanders were immediately good at. The first festival of this kind, Redwood 70, took place in January 1970, just a few days after the New Zealand visit of US Vice President Spiro Agnew, which had seen violent confrontations between police and protesters in Auckland. This is Rachel and her friends. Here we are at the Agnew demo. And Redwood 70 also erupted into violence on the first night, with missiles being hurled at and audience members invading the stage, while the main act, Robin Gibb from the Bee Gees, fled mid-performance. A film of the event showing police handling of the crowds bears strong similarities to the confrontations between police and protesters that had taken place just days before, and one can imagine recent events were fresh in the minds of both parties. Gradually, and generally accepted as the most pacific of the big festivals in the early 70s, was the one held in Ngaruahia in January 1973, which drew about 18,000 people for 3 days. In part, its success, at least in terms of its atmosphere, seems to have stemmed from a light-handed approach to security. Much of this task was undertaken by Eden Security, a predominantly Maori firm run by Hugh Lynn, a former child tap dancing champion and go-go dance instructor, whose first venture into security provision had been during the Pretty Things tour in 1965. And as he told Kushla Donaldson in her impressionistic documentary, The Great Ngaruahia Music Festival, Maori were very comfortable with large numbers of people, tangi, marae, that sort of thing, and there was an ease in communicating with people. We're not going to arrest you for smoking dope or having sex. Taking your clothes off isn't hurting anybody, and we didn't worry. Although the term free love had been around since the 19th century, its resurgence among the counterculture made it clear that Oswald Maisengard's recommendations had not been universally adopted. In 1967, acting under the discipline regulations of the University of Otago Council, Vice-Chancellor Robin Williams enforced a ban on what was termed mixed flatting, singling out a 19-year-old final year psychology student who was sharing a flat with 3 women. He was a male student, and he demanded that the student leave the flat or else face expulsion from the university. Though the student and his flatmates were cohabiting with the full consent of their landlord and their parents, and none of them were in fact involved in a relationship, to a portion of society, the idea of young unmarried people of mixed gender living under the same roof was simply immoral. But it represented more than that. Writing under the pseudonym Teach Them, a correspondent to the Otago Daily Times declared, "This controversy started over mixed flatting only, but is now extended to a general moral freedom. We of the older generation left school at an early age and worked to help support ourselves, our sick and our elderly during the Depression. What freedom did we have? We are the ones who suffered 6 years of war to keep our country free for our children. We gave up many freedoms during the war and since to establish a better way of life. We have given our children a chance to develop their talents, only to find that we have also given them too much freedom. It has become the only word in their vocabulary. They know nothing of gratitude, appreciation, pride of nation, race, country, or even pride of family. Modesty, self-respect, courtesy have all fallen to the axe of this horrible word, freedom, which is not freedom at all, but abuse. Put a stop to this. Close the universities to all but a few well-chosen young people who can prove they're worth spending our money on. Send the others out to the freedom of finding work for themselves and a chance to do something better than waste their time and hours with childish demonstrations. Let the students realise that their job is not to fight for more freedom, but to preserve and maintain the freedom which can only be enjoyed by law-abiding citizens. To which a student responded on the same letters page a couple of days later. It is now 22 years since World War II, since I was born, and many more years since the Depression. Must we have the hard time stories stuffed down our throats year after year? What do you expect us to do? Crawl to you every 5 minutes and thank you for the wonderful world you've made for us? This world is not such a mightily fantastic place to live in anyway. The mixed flatting feud was clearly a symptom of the wider generational divide. And despite Dr. Williams' efforts to stem it in Dunedin, it was already widespread, particularly in the university towns. Flatting didn't just make it feasible to sleep with your partner. Flats could be conscious experiments in communal living, in which all the accepted conditions for the survival of the species, food, shelter, clothing, sex, were reconsidered. By the early 70s, our Beatle fan, Rachel, was living with 13 others in a rambling two-storey villa in Herne Bay. An outhouse and adjoining cottage were included in a total rental of $36 per week. Their shared interests included drugs, sex, clothing, and music. That's a few of them. The general affluence of that period meant it was possible to work in paid employment only as much as was necessary, reserving the maximum amount of time for the things that mattered most, whether creative, spiritual, political, or recreational. Rachel worked as a postie, then as a clerk in a government agency, leaving each job once she'd amassed enough money to pay her way for the next few months. Other members of the household took a similarly pragmatic, career-averse approach to employment. One or two were students living on bursaries. Rachel and her friends sewed their own clothes or bought them second-hand from op shops and dyed them in psychedelically vibrant colours. We loved dressing up, she told me. We loved costumes, colour, texture, velvet, patterns, all that stuff. We'd go out of our way to look absolutely gorgeous. Often, she added, they didn't wear any clothes at all. Closely related to the communal flat, but with some distinct characteristics of its own, was the crash pad, a property rented or perhaps squatted with an unfixed roster of residents. Some occupants would be semi-permanent, others might stay a night, a week, or a month. Crashers had usually learned about the place by word of mouth. They'd turn up unannounced, perhaps offering the name of some shared acquaintance by way of reference, and sleep wherever they could find available space. Around the country, other kinds of communities were beginning to take shape, more expansive than flats, and more organised than crash pads. In December 1971, a journalist for the Evening Post visited a country house in Taitapu, 20 kilometres out of Christchurch, where a group of 17 to 20-year-olds had formed a commune. The group were remnants of the Winchester Commune, an urban community founded on anarchist principles who'd gone rural after being evicted from their central Christchurch premises. The commune was based on sharing, a 17-year-old communard explained. We do casual work, the money we get goes into a tin. We all live out of the tin. Sometimes we do go short, but when that happens, we all budget and we all help each other. The most publicised commune in this period was the one founded by the poet and social critic James K. Baxter. For many years, he'd been venting his views on society's ills in poetry and polemics. Well, in many ways, he was an anomalous figure in the counterculture. Wrong generation, wrong religion, he was a Catholic convert, wrong temperament, and there was no comparable figure in the international movement. He certainly provided the counterculture in this country with a very public face. By 1970, he left his family in Nio, shed his shoes, let his hair and beard grow so he looked like a cross between a hippie, a homeless person and an Old Testament prophet, and gone to Jerusalem on the upper reaches of the Whanganui River, where on land adjoining a Catholic mission station and a Maori community, he attempted to set up a commune of his own, with the aim of providing a refuge for young people who were burned out, either by drugs or mental health issues arising from the pressures of mainstream society. Baxter's Jerusalem may have been therapeutic for some, but was hardly utopian. In the words of one medium-term resident, it wasn't a commune, it was a rural crash pad. But in other parts of the country, variations on this model sprung up, not all of them centred on a charismatic leader like Baxter. The founders and inhabitants of the communes represented a range of intentions. There were those who were attracted by ideals of self-sufficiency and living sustainably in harmony with the environment. They farmed, grew things, and built elaborate shelters. Some developed crafts such as pottery and weaving. Some sought an alternative way to raise their children other than a suburban nuclear family. Some went to have sex with a lot of different people. Some wanted to be left alone to take drugs. Remote rural locations provided opportunities for the clandestine cultivation of cannabis. The police, it was hoped, would be many valleys away. Some went to be closer to God. At one commune, Sunburst, some of the members followed the teenage Indian guru Maharaji, while the Sunday Creek commune was, for a period, almost entirely made up of orange-clad followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. It was around about this time on a Hokianga back road that an encounter took place between a member of the Counterculture and a member of Parliament. In early summer 1972, the general election campaign was underway and Matiu Rata, MP for Northern Maori, was on the campaign trail. With him in his Chevrolet Impala were two helpers, both Maori like himself, all three wearing suits. They were hot, uncomfortable, and in a hurry. Moving slowly towards them came a figure on horseback, dressed only in what appeared to be a kind of loincloth. He was an American and had spent the past couple of years subsisting on a remote piece of land. For Rata, it was both a paradox and an epiphany. Here they were, three Maori sweltering in suits in this ostentatious American car, while the barely clad Pākehā seemed comfortable, indifferent, with all the time in the world, apparently living a life more akin to that of pre-colonial Maori. Over the next year, Rata would devise a scheme for making tracts of Crown land available for a peppercorn fee to any young people wanting to start their own communities. And it would be taken up with alacrity by the newly elected Labour Prime Minister, Norman Kirk. Here they are, Matiu Rata and Norman Kirk. Though Kirk could hardly have been mistaken for a hippie, he shared some of the Counterculture's distaste for materialism and wish for more communal values. The Ohu scheme, as it became known, Ohu meaning communal working group, appealed to Kirk as, quote, an antidote to the ills of modern society, as well as a means of showing people the virtues of a simpler life. Matiu Rata, addressing the Ohu Working Party in August 1974, enlarged on this point of view. He said, the overemphasis on the gross national product, perpetual greed, speculation, profiteering, unethical practices, and the cult of individualism can only result in the further alienation of those who seek a return to community and group feelings. I share with other government members the hope that the Ohu will, in some way, lead the way to a more concerned society and recapture anew the deep links of people and the land. Yet, despite the enthusiasm of Rata, Kirk, and some other government members, there was opposition at lower levels of bureaucracy that would ultimately undermine them. Federated Farmers, which had a representative on their Ohu Advisory Committee, vocally criticised the scheme. If the idea of small communities of artisans springing up in the wilderness appealed to Kirk, it horrified some of the county councils who blocked building consents. And there was the ill-preparedness of some of the communards themselves, many of whom had urban upbringings and often little idea of how to actually survive on the land. Still, the election of Norman Kirk as Prime Minister in November 1972 did in many ways see the mainstreaming for the first time of countercultural ideas, the Ohu scheme being just one of them. It might not have been the dawning of the age of Aquarius, but after 12 years of National Party rule, it must have almost felt like it. In the brief time he would spend as Prime Minister, from his election until his sudden death 21 months later, Kirk showed he was at least curious about what younger citizens had to say. He ordered the rugby union to call off a New Zealand tour by the Springboks, dispatched a frigate to sail to Mururoa Atoll to protest French nuclear tests, and halted National's plan to raise the level of Lake Manapuri. In each of these acts, addressing one or more of the causes that had come to be associated with the counterculture, whether it was communalism, the environment, calls for peace, or equality. And Labor introduced the domestic purposes benefit, a social welfare payment given to single parents with dependent children. This acknowledgement that the nuclear family was not the only social unit, that child rearing was important work, and the handing of some degree of autonomy to young women represented a major shift in social thinking. But other forces were massing against the counterculture, and some of them seemed to come from within. While the use of marijuana, along with long hair and rock music, had by the mid-70s spread through mainstream New Zealand, among the counterculture, other kinds of drugs were becoming more common. Opiates had been used by a small number of New Zealanders in the 60s, but around 1974, a former menswear salesman called Marty Johnston and a safecracker receiver and occasional police informer called Terry Clark teamed up, first to import from Asia massive amounts of a particularly strong marijuana known as Buddha, then to branch into heroin, the ideal product for a capitalist paradigm, as its addictive nature and the increasing amounts needed as the user's tolerance develops ensures an ongoing and growing demand. When supplies are scarce, some resort to crimes such as burglary. Preoccupied with maintaining their supply, addicts are drawn to others with the same need. So, while in some ways heroin could be considered to be the most countercultural of drugs in that its user can appear to have completely rejected the cultural values of the mainstream, it also created an isolated subculture within the counterculture, one which ultimately contributed to its disintegration. It would be simple and convenient to say that heroin killed the counterculture, a fatal accidental overdose. Clark and Johnson certainly made their special contributions to the counterculture's decline. Yet looking back, there are other signs and reasons why it was coming to an end. As we've seen, by 1975, many of the things the 60s rebels had laid themselves on the line for had been absorbed into the life of Middle New Zealand. Countercultural signifiers no longer automatically linked a person to a string of radical causes. To all intents and purposes, the Vietnam War was over, so having long hair and smoking marijuana no longer identified you as someone who would also, in all likelihood, be against war. The number of people going to church or identifying themselves as religious had declined steadily between 1960 and 1975. Christian morality was no longer much of a deterrent to drug taking or premarital sex. Contraception was becoming easier to acquire. While on the one hand, these things might be taken as signs that the counterculture had triumphed, in another way, they created a vacuum which emergent forces would come to exploit. The 60s had provided ideal conditions for the countercultural experiment. The affluence of the era had enabled an unprecedented number of young people to leave home and experience a life with very few restrictions. Casual work, cheap accommodation, and a culture of sharing kept them from poverty, while they considered global injustices or appreciated the finer qualities of Afghani hashish. It's one of my interviewees behind the tourist office somewhere in Pakistan. Some spent time on the so-called hippie trail, travelling overland through Asia and Europe in pursuit of spiritual enlightenment or cheap drugs. Some went to university where, without paying fees or incurring debt, they could spend much of the academic year engaged in extracurricular activities of one kind or another. The campuses were loci for teach-ins and happenings, but there are other centres of countercultural activity as well, in pubs, parks, crash pads and communes. This is, on the left, Germaine Greer, the Australian feminist and counterculturist with Sharon Sederman in the centre, and Sue Kedgley, the founding members of Women's Liberation in New Zealand. And Germaine Greer was amongst the first to recognise that the countercultural way of life was unsustainable. In 1972, just a few months after a controversial visit to New Zealand, she wrote, "The hippie is the sign of surplus value. The dropout can only claim sanctity in a society which offers something to be dropped out of." For others, the first hint that the era was coming to an end was the international oil shock of the following year, which, in combination with the gradual decline in exports, tipped the country into economic recession. Persuaded that a national government would be better equipped to manage the crisis than Labour, who had lost their leader Norman Kirk in 1974, the country elected National to power in 1975, and Robert Muldoon became Prime Minister. It's a sea of Muldoons from a magazine called Earwig, which was sort of one of the cornerstones of the countercultural press in New Zealand, and it's been very useful to me as a sort of time capsule of what people were thinking about at the time. And the collage was done by Earwig's editor, Jonathan Milne. For others, the first hint that the era was coming to an end was the international oil shock. Oh, we've had that. Inflation and unemployment slowly rose, while income stagnated as Muldoon tried to soften the blow with overseas borrowing. Muldoon was certainly no fan of protesters, drug takers, hippies and Ohu schemes, though ironically his interventionist approach to the economy may have helped prolong their viability. Ultimately, though, it became far more difficult to support a countercultural lifestyle, and while some certainly continued to do so, they would move further and further to the margins of society. This economic change also coincided with a turn of the generational wheel. In 1975, the first of the baby boomers, born in 1945, turned 30. Having devoted their teens and 20s to challenging the rule of their parents, many were now parents themselves and trying to figure out what rules might actually be required for their own survival. They'd enjoyed many privileges their parents never had: shelter, mobility, affordable education, work when they wanted it, leisure if they preferred. They'd had the time and means to ask questions, and had seemingly questioned everything except their own good luck. And it should be noted here, if I haven't already made it apparent, that the counterculture drew predominantly, though not exclusively, from the Pākehā middle class. Though their protest cries had sometimes made them sound like victims of a totalitarian regime, they had enjoyed considerable freedoms. When these privileges were threatened by changes in the country's economic fortunes, some went back and finished their degrees, joined the family firm and got on with their middle-class lives, and probably still smoked dope on the weekends. The countercultural male had been the most privileged of all. Though some men had lent support to the idea of women's liberation, which in its early stages had close links to the counterculture, sharing printing facilities with the underground papers, holding their meetings in urban communes or radical bookshops. In reality, few men were moved to make the substantial changes women's liberation required of them. Comfortable with their masculine prerogatives, there was a reluctance to share or relinquish power. Some took their entitlements into alternative spaces, such as the communes, where in many cases women were expected to take care of children and domestic chores in 19th century conditions. As the 70s unfolded, the women's movement tended to turn away from alternative communities and focus on trying to change existing institutions. Not that the alternative communities ended there. In 1975, many communes were only just getting started. Yet, as each one strived to define itself, the connection to a wider idea of a counterculture was sometimes lost. In her study of 4 intentional communities in New Zealand, Olive Jones noted that many would gradually break up into separate households. Cooperative activity would become inconsistent, and that initial utopian idealism was gradually replaced by the desire for a comfortable lifestyle. Eventually, some communes would seem little different than a friendly rural suburb. As the founding populations grew older, the younger members of the communities would usually just move away. Looking back today, the counterculture might seem to be riven with paradoxes. There were visions of nuclear apocalypse and dreams of a utopian future, a belief that society could be changed, and yet a simultaneous retreat from society. Ideas of tolerance, diversity and acceptance, yet white middle-class men predominated. An emphasis on large collective projects, protest marches, communal living, experiments, happenings and festivals, and yet the individual experience was so often central. To the previous generation, home improvement was a more meaningful concept than self-improvement. They hadn't had time for health foods or therapy groups, meditation or marijuana. They had fences to paint and lawns to mow. The historian Dick Scott seemed to speak for many of them when, in reviewing the Whole Earth catalogue, one of the counterculture's foundational texts, he characterised the inwardly directed activities of the counterculture as narcissistic. To the left-wing commentator Bruce Jesson, writing in the mid-80s, the political discourse during the countercultural era, even when it looked outward, had been focused on the wrong things. The 60s should have been a time of questioning the direction of New Zealand society, he wrote. Instead, public affairs were dominated by debates about the Vietnam War and South Africa, end of quote. While young questioning minds were concerned with the moral failings of other nations, not to mention their own LSD trips, sexual revolutions and paths to spiritual enlightenment, their neoliberal contemporaries had been left unchecked to develop radical economic strategies that would reshape New Zealand. It could even be argued that the neoliberal reforms launched by the Fourth Labour government in the 80s were in fact an outgrowth of countercultural ideals. Headed by David Lange, this would be the first government cabinet to be substantially made up of baby boomers. Some of them had been students in the late 60s and early 70s when the university quadrangles were ringing to the sounds of anti-war chants and psychedelic rock bands. Theirs was the generation that had challenged the restrictions on a whole catalogue of freedoms, restrictions their parents had accepted as facts of life. They'd campaigned for sexual liberation, women's liberation, environmental awareness and freedom from nuclear annihilation. Almost immediately, the Fourth Labour government enacted a number of reforms that acknowledged such campaigns. They established a Ministry of Women's Affairs to address issues raised by the women's liberation movement. They passed the Homosexual Law Reform Act, decriminalising sexual relations between men over 16, set up a Ministry of Conservation, charged with protecting the natural environment, and once more suspended sporting relations with apartheid South Africa. Most flamboyantly, David Lange, who in his own mythology had been haunted by a vision of a man-made apocalypse since witnessing at age 20 the glow in the Auckland sky from a nuclear test, debated right-wing American evangelist Jerry Falwell at the televised Oxford Union debate, arguing with great charisma the proposition that nuclear weapons are morally indefensible, winning the debate and becoming for a while the world's anti-nuclear poster boy. When Labour followed up in 1987 by passing the New Zealand Nuclear Free Zone, Disarmament and Arms Control Act, singer-songwriter Shona Lang wrote the upbeat anthem Neutral and Nuclear Free in celebration. It seemed as though all the counterculture's calls for freedom were finally being heeded at the highest levels of power. But for those boomers now in government, freedom came in many forms. And along with their support for a freer society came their demand for a freer economy. We know what happened. A few people made a lot of money. A lot of people lost jobs and would never again have the security of regular work and income. By the end of the decade, 10% of the population and a quarter of all Maori were unemployed. And yet, while no successive government, whether Labour or National-led, has ever really reversed those neoliberal reforms, neither has the other side of the countercultural coin been completely erased. When Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern brings a term like well-being into the political discourse, or talks of kindness and the simple concept of looking outwardly and beyond ourselves, she sounds more like she's come from an alternative lifestyles workshop than a roundtable session with Roger Douglas. Then there are the Greens, who emerged from the remnants of the Values Party, who really were the first political party, one of the first in the world, in fact, to have countercultural ideas in their manifesto. Grounded in countercultural values, early Green candidates included various former communards, environmental activists, and people who would once have been described as hippies. There are many other ways in which countercultural seeds have taken root in New Zealand life, such institutions as food co-ops, community law centres, street fairs and markets, festivals and pride parades, all have countercultural origins. Today you'll find co-housing projects and eco-neighbourhoods addressing ideas of socially and environmentally sustainable living, ideas that counterculture first articulated in the 60s and 70s. These days, 1 in 10 New Zealanders is a vegetarian. Offal or lamb chops are pretty well off the breakfast menu now, replaced by muesli or yogurt, which were unimaginably exotic foodstuffs in the early 60s. In the 2018 census, almost half the population said they had no religious affiliation, while alternative paths to spiritual fulfillment, such as meditation and yoga, have become so widespread as to be considered mainstream. The old guard of moralising doctors who decided who could and couldn't have contraception have largely gone. Premarital sex and couples living together and having children out of wedlock have ceased to be a subject of moral panic. The Marriage Amendment Act in 2013 allowed same-sex couples to marry. Public discussions now turn to issues of gender diversity. While the expression free love might have gone out of vogue, terms like polyamory and open relationship are part of the post-millennial vernacular and could perhaps be seen as free love with more clearly defined boundaries and conditions. At the same time, the old countercultural cry of freedom can be heard echoing back in such quarters as the anti-vaccination movement, which has seen a militant resurgence in this era of COVID-19. Its proponents share certain traits with the protesters of the 60s and 70s, a belief that personal liberties, including freedom of speech, are under threat, a suspicion of state surveillance and government conspiracies. Some of their ideas can be linked to theories about bodily purity and alternative medicine introduced by the counterculture. They employ familiar protest techniques such as marches, pickets, and acts of civil disobedience. Though this movement has sprung up in different parts of the country, it has a particular visibility in some of the places that attracted the original communards, such as Nelson and Coromandel. And there's at least one intentional community in the Nelson region that espouses anti-vaccination as one of its fundamental tenets. The message seems a highly individualistic one, placing personal freedoms above the safety of the wider community. As we saw with the Fourth Labour government, freedom can be interpreted in many ways. But other recent movements seem more altruistic. A renewal of youth activism can be found in climate strikes and rallies against racism, sexual violence, and all forms of inequality. If these protests don't have the carnival spirit of some of the 60s and 70s gatherings, that may just be a measure of how much more urgent the issues have become. Looking back, the counterculture can seem both exuberant and ignorant, idealistic and egocentric. There were acts of bravery in the name of social justice, feats of imagination in the name of art and fun. At the same time, it's easy to see why it's sometimes characterised as the folly of a spoilt generation who had it all and wanted more, yet failed to ensure that their children would be able to enjoy the same freedoms. It's hardly surprising if today's university students are less inclined to sacrifice their grades for sit-ins and happenings when you consider the giant debts they'll graduate with, when home ownership is beyond the reach of all but the most privileged, when rents are extortionate and thousands are sleeping in cars and streets. James K. Baxter's laments about suburbia's well-lit prisons seem oddly beside the point. Stories of job surpluses and landlords that demand less than half your income in rent now feel like fantasies. The nuclear sword that still hangs over the planet has been joined by the even more inexorable threat of climate change. Sustainability, a utopian aspiration in the early days of communes and whole earth catalogues, is recognised by today's youth as a necessity for the survival of the planet. But millennials and their successors are also discussing a vision of this country's future that was barely articulated in the conversations of the counterculture. Decolonisation, or as Moana Jackson prefers, the ethic of restoration. As I understand it, this doesn't mean Pākehā retreating to wherever their ancestors came from. Rather, it requires them to recognise that to live in this country is to exist in terms of one's relationship with Māori under Te Tiriti or Waitangi. Not only does this acknowledge tino rangatiratanga, the traditions, independence and authority of the tangata whenua, it also gives Pākehā a positive and realistic way of seeing themselves. My parents, who both grew up in this country, though my mother arrived as a refugee at the age of 3, only really knew that they were Pākehā New Zealanders rather than Europeans when they went to London for the first time in 1959 and realised that their creative dreams and visions of a better society didn't belong there, but back where they'd come from. If the anti-apartheid movement that culminated in the 1981 Springbok Tour protests helped speed the end of South African apartheid, it also made it harder for Pākehā in New Zealand to ignore the systemic racism in this country that they call home. Today it seems almost quaint to have ever thought in terms of a counterculture in New Zealand, when to Maori the whole of Pākehā society could be seen as just that, a counter to their culture, a barbaric intrusion upon the culture that was already here, fully formed, with its stories, its obligations and intellectual traditions long before the colonists came. Viewed from this perspective, what we call the counterculture can just look like another part of the colonial baggage. Then again, to help create a successful decolonised future, one might draw on some of the things that characterised the counterculture at its best: imagination, empathy, bravery, romance, respect for the land, great music, sense of humour, sense of justice. I might sum it up as a change of consciousness. Thank you.
Well, that was a magnificent, wide-ranging, thoughtful, subtle, challenging presentation, I think. Bits of it would have been familiar to all of us who perhaps lived through or know about or were small or not thought of during those years. Some of it will have been new. Weaving it together in that way is original. And above all, I think what Nick has done is avoided the trap of nostalgia and challenged us to think about what this history might mean for Aotearoa in the future. I think we will leave it there rather than invite questions. It was a most extensive and well put together presentation. More than a presentation, that sounds like so trivial. It was magnificent. We can only look forward to the book and to the debate, discussion and perhaps challenge that it will pose. So once again, can I ask you to thank our 2021 John David Stout Fellow Nick Bollinger for his lecture and to wish him well for the final stages of his project.